They are not angry because they lost you. They are upset because they lost control. And everything they intended to break, you ended up breaking within them instead. What really happens when a narcissist's carefully designed game falls apart? You don't just see anger, you witness shock, panic, and a side of them they never wanted you to notice. If this feels familiar to you, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, have you recently stopped reacting, stopped explaining, stopped chasing? Because that shift right there, that is exactly what starts this collapse. When everything a narcissist does revolves around control, the moment that control slips, it doesn't just annoy them, it shakes them at their core. Their entire way of connecting with people depends on carefully controlled outcomes. They observe your reactions, understand your emotional triggers, and shape their behavior in a way that keeps them in the dominant role. It's not accidental, it's calculated. So when those methods stop working, when you stop responding the way they expect, when you no longer engage in the emotional cycles they depend on, it creates a kind of psychological disruption for them. They are used to pulling strings and getting predictable outcomes. If they withdraw, you chase. If they provoke, you react. If they manipulate, you question yourself. That predictability is what gives them a sense of control and stability. But when you interrupt that pattern, when you become calm, distant, or indifferent, it removes the very feedback system they rely on. Suddenly, their usual tactics stop working. The silence they thought would hurt you strengthens you. The chaos they tried to create no longer pulls you in. This is where the unraveling begins, because without control, they don't have a stable sense of self. Their identity is built on dominance, on being the one who controls the emotional environment. When that disappears, they are left with confusion, irritation, and a growing sense of exposure. It feels like losing hold of something they believed was certain. And what makes it even more unsettling for them is that they never expected this result. In their mind, their methods always work. So when everything backfires, it doesn't feel like a simple mistake. It feels like a disruption of the reality they created where they are always in charge. What appears as rage on the surface is rarely about losing you. It's about losing the influence they once had over you. For a narcissist, relationships are not based on mutual care or emotional connection in the way most people understand them. Instead, they are built around control, validation, and dominance. You were never just a partner, a friend, or a support system. You were a source of supply, a reflection that reinforced their sense of importance and superiority. So when that source is interrupted, when you pull back, set boundaries, or simply stop reacting the way you once did, the emotional reaction you see from them is not grief, it's anger. But that anger is very specific. It's the reaction of someone who feels their authority has been challenged. It's the frustration of losing influence over someone they once could predict and manage easily. They may say things that sound like they miss you or accuse you of leaving them, but underneath those words is a deeper unrest. What they are really responding to is the shift in power. You are no longer available in the same way. You are no longer confirming their version of reality. And most importantly, you are no longer under their control. This is why their anger can seem exaggerated or confusing. To an outsider, it might look like an overreaction to distance or a breakup, but internally for them, it feels like a collapse of their position. The loss of control triggers a kind of panic because it reveals how dependent they were on that dynamic to feel stable. And instead of processing that loss in a healthy way, They push it outward, they blame, they lash out, they try to regain dominance through pressure or manipulation, because regaining control feels far more urgent to them than understanding what was actually lost. When a narcissist's plans fail, what gets revealed is not just a failed strategy, it's the fragility of the identity they've been protecting all along. At their core, narcissists rely on a carefully constructed self-image that tells them they are superior, untouchable, and always in control. This image isn't just confidence. It's a defense. It protects them from deep insecurity and shame that they cannot face directly. So every manipulation, every calculated move, every attempt to control a narrative is ultimately serving that image. They need to believe they are smarter than you, more strategic than you, always ahead. That belief is what keeps their inner world from falling apart. But when their plans don't work, when you don't react, when others don't accept their version of events, when consequences begin to catch up, it creates cracks in that illusion. And those cracks are deeply unsettling because now they are forced, whether they admit it or not, to face a reality where they are not in control, not admired, and not winning. That directly threatens the identity they've built. It introduces doubt, and doubt is something they are not equipped to handle in a healthy way. Instead of reflecting or taking responsibility, they experience internal conflict. On one side, they still want to believe they are superior. On the other, reality is showing them something different. This tension doesn't lead to growth, it leads to defensiveness. They may double down on their behavior, rewrite the story, or become even more aggressive in trying to prove their dominance. But underneath all of that is a fragile self trying to hold itself together. Because the backfire didn't just ruin their plan, it threatened the very image they rely on to feel whole. One of the most destabilizing parts of everything failing for a narcissist is the shock that comes with it. They don't just experience failure, they experience disbelief. In their internal world, they operate with a strong sense of certainty that their methods will always work. They have relied on manipulation, charm, intimidation, or emotional chaos for so long that it becomes predictable to them. They expect people to give in, to doubt themselves, to come back, to react. Resistance is not something they account for. So when you don't respond the way they expected, when you stay calm, when you set boundaries, when you walk away without engaging, it disrupts their entire expectation system. It's not just unexpected, it feels unreal to them. They may replay interactions in their mind, trying to understand where it went wrong. But the truth is, what went wrong is that their usual approach no longer works on you. That's where the shock deepens because it pushes them into unfamiliar territory. They are no longer in a position of certainty or control, and they don't have the emotional tools to adjust in a healthy way. Instead of adapting, they often become reactive. You might see sudden mood swings, confusion turning into anger, or attempts to re-enter your life just to check if they can still get a response. The shock also comes from a deeper level. They never truly saw you as someone who could step outside the role they assigned to you. In their mind, your role was fixed. So when you step out of that role, it challenges not only their expectations, but their perception of you. And that's what makes it powerful, because your resistance doesn't just interrupt their plan. It forces them to face a reality where they are no longer the one deciding how everything unfolds. When a narcissist smear campaign starts to fall apart, it creates a very specific kind of inner panic that is difficult for them to contain. Smear campaigns are not random gossip or character attacks. They are strategic efforts to control the narrative, protect their image, and isolate you from support. By portraying you as the problem, they maintain their position as the victim or the superior one, while ensuring others see them through the lens they've created. For a while, this often works. People may believe them, question you, or stay neutral out of uncertainty. And that initial success strengthens their confidence in their ability to influence perception. But when inconsistencies begin to appear, when their stories don't match, or when your behavior remains calm and grounded in contrast to their claims, the narrative begins to crack. And those cracks are frightening for them because once doubt enters the minds of others, the control they had over the story begins to slip. People may start asking questions, noticing patterns, or comparing experiences. The very tool they use to dominate the situation begins to turn against them. Instead of strengthening their image, it starts exposing their behavior. This is where panic builds. Not always in an obvious way, but internally, there is a surge of urgency. They may try to reinforce the story more aggressively, spreading more claims, exaggerating further, or even trying to provoke you into reacting so they can justify their version. The need to regain control becomes intense because their reputation feels at risk. And for a narcissist, reputation is everything. It's not just how others see them, it's how they hold on to their sense of self. So when the smear campaign falls apart, it doesn't just fail as a tactic, it threatens the entire image they've been trying to maintain, creating a level of panic that leads to even more desperate behavior. When everything they planned begins to fail, one of the clearest responses is their sudden shift into desperate attempts to pull you back in. This can feel confusing because the same person who was distant, dismissive, or even harsh can quickly become attentive, apologetic, or unusually persistent. But this shift isn't coming from genuine growth or reflection. It's coming from a need to regain control over a situation that is slipping away. Narcissists rely heavily on what you provide emotionally, your attention, your reactions, your energy. When that supply is cut off, especially after their plans have failed, it creates a void they are not prepared to handle. Instead of processing the loss in a healthy way, they go into recovery mode. And that recovery mode often looks like reaching out, circling back, or trying to reconnect in ways that feel urgent or overwhelming. They may act as if nothing happened, sending casual messages to test the situation, or they might take a more emotional approach, apologizing, reminiscing, or showing vulnerability in a way that feels unfamiliar. In some cases, they may even present themselves as changed, as if they have suddenly realized their behavior. But beneath all of these actions is the same goal: to reopen the connection so they can place themselves back into your emotional space. What makes this phase especially misleading is that it can look like closure or reconciliation. It can bring up old emotions, old hopes, or a sense of familiarity that pulls you back toward them. But in reality, it is a reaction to losing control, not a sign of true accountability. Because if their earlier tactics had worked, this version of them would likely never appear. It only shows up when everything else has failed and they are trying to restore the dynamic where they once had power. What often lies beneath the anger, manipulation, and desperate attempts to regain control is something far less visible but far more powerful: shame. Not the kind of healthy shame that leads to growth, but a deep, overwhelming sense of inadequacy that a narcissist has spent a lifetime avoiding. This is why their reactions can seem so intense when things fall apart. It's not just frustration, it's exposure of something they work very hard to hide. When their plans fail, when their control weakens, when people stop believing their story, it doesn't just inconvenience them, it threatens to reveal that underlying insecurity. And that is something they cannot tolerate. So instead of facing it, they defend against it. The anger you see becomes a shield. The blame they place on you becomes a way to redirect attention. The rewriting of events becomes a way to protect their self image because accepting responsibility, even slightly, would bring them closer to that shame. And for them, that feels unbearable. So they push it outward, they project, they accuse, they escalate. This is why their reactions often seem out of proportion to what is happening. A small boundary from you can trigger a large emotional reaction from them. Your calm distance can provoke intense hostility. It's not because of what you're doing, it's because of what your actions represent. They represent a loss of control, a crack in their identity, and a moment where they can no longer avoid what is underneath. And instead of facing that discomfort, they fight against it with everything they have, using anger as a way to stay disconnected from the vulnerability they refuse to face. One of the most powerful and unsettling triggers for a narcissist is your growth, especially when that growth leads to emotional distance from them. When you begin to heal, to see clearly, and to no longer depend on their validation or approval, it disrupts the entire dynamic they once depended on. Because for them, the relationship was never just about connection. It was about influence, about knowing they could shape how you feel, think, and respond. Your distance removes that influence. At first, they may not notice immediately. They might assume you are just taking space or going through a phase. But as your responses become more consistent, calm instead of reactive, distant instead of involved, they begin to sense that something has truly changed. You are no longer feeding the patterns that once kept them in control. You are no longer explaining yourself, defending yourself, or trying to gain their approval. And that shift is deeply unsettling for them because your growth represents something they cannot easily access within themselves. It shows independence, awareness, and emotional stability, qualities that do not align with how they maintain their identity. Instead of feeling inspired, they feel threatened. Your progress highlights their loss of control, and that contrast becomes difficult for them to handle. This is why they may respond with increased anger, attempts to pull you back, or efforts to disrupt your progress. They may try to provoke you, bring up the past, or create situations to test whether they can still get a reaction. But the more grounded you remain, the clearer the shift becomes. Because in the end, it is not your words that show them they have lost control. It is your consistency, your ability to stay steady, to not return to the chaos becomes undeniable proof that the dynamic has changed and that you are no longer someone they can easily influence. In the end, what you are witnessing is not just anger or shock. It is the collapse of a system that once worked perfectly for them. Every manipulation, every calculated move, every attempt to control you was built on one assumption, that you would always play your role. But the moment you stepped out of that role, everything they built started to fall apart. Their rage is not about love. Their panic is not about losing you as a person. It is about losing access, losing control, and losing the version of reality where they were always in charge. And when that illusion breaks, they are left scrambling, not to repair the relationship, but to restore their dominance. But here's the truth that changes everything. Once you see the pattern, once you stop feeding it, once you choose your peace over their chaos, you have already shifted the outcome. Their strategies lose power not because they changed, but because you did. So their anger, their shock, their desperate attempts, they are not signs that you lost something valuable. They are signs that you freed yourself from something that was designed to keep you small. And the more you stay grounded in that awareness, the clearer it becomes. This was never about them winning or losing. It was always about you finally stepping out of it,